I'm afraid the progressive part of politics has taken some just pretty foolish positions. You're either a disruptor or you're disrupted, and that's your choice. There's no mystery to me why Donald Trump won in America. Europe's got to be really careful. It cannot stifle innovation. If it does it, it will set back the European economy dramatically. I'll never be glad about Brexit, but if there is any benefit from doing it, it is that if Europe moves in an adverse, in a too restrictive way on regulation, then of course Britain's got the advantage of being able to set a different framework.
Hello and welcome to Tell Me More, the first English-speaking talk of Germany's Die Zeit. I'm Jochen Bittner.
And I'm Heinrich Wefing.
And we are joined by Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So Tony, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
You've just published a book called On Leadership, and you said that you yourself would have loved to have had such a book when you started as Prime Minister in 1997. What would the senior Tony Blair have to tell his younger self from today's point of view, or indeed any other younger leader?
Yeah, a lot, because, you know, the thing with politics is it's about the only profession you can think of that is of immense importance, where people can be put in positions of leadership with no experience of governing. They may have experience of politics, but that's a different thing. But of government, and government is really tough. And what happens is, you know, when you're trying to reach government, you've got to be the great persuader, right? It's all about communication. But when you're in government, you've got to become a great chief executive, because it's actually like running a business. And so what I tried to set out in the book are the lessons that I learned from my 10 years as Prime Minister, but also afterwards advising governments around the world with my institute. We're now in roughly 45 countries, so we've got a lot of experience. But the lessons are remarkably the same. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're in a developed country like the UK or Germany, or a developing African country. The lessons of how you focus, how you prioritize, how you drive change, pretty much the same.
One might think that this book was partly designed to give counsel to Keir Starmer, the new Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Was it?
Well, one might think that, but no. Because actually it was supposed to be written a couple of years ago, but I didn't have the time to get it finished. But, you know, whether it's Keir coming into office or whoever it is, I get a lot of messages from leaders from different parts of the world who read it and say, you know, it speaks to my condition. Because the other thing is, you've got masses of books around how to be a professional coach, how to be a CEO. You don't really have anything that's about how to be a political leader in government.
Have you ever met with Friedrich Merz, who might become the next German Chancellor?
I think I have met him, but I can't be absolutely sure in the past, not recently.
Right.
But yeah.
He might become the next German Chancellor. He never held public office. He never led an administration. So he's basically just in the same position that you were when you became Prime Minister. What would be your first advice to an incoming German Chancellor be?
Well, first of all, by the way, German politics is for you. Who becomes German Chancellor for you guys is not my business. And I think I'm right in saying that Mr. Merz has had experience before of being a minister.
No. He never. No.
But experienced the private sector at least.
He was the opposition leader in the German parliament.
We'll have learned a bit doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I tell you what I'd say, which is what I say to every politician I see now, particularly in the Western world. We are in a different era today, politically. And my view is you're either a disruptor or you're disrupted. And that's your choice. So what is happening in all developed countries is people are saying to their political leadership, we're paying a lot in taxes, we're spending a lot of money, the outcomes for our services are poor, the system is not working for us and you've got to change it fundamentally. Now, when I was Prime Minister, we were in a different era. People expected us to change the system, but in a sense, change it within the box, within the conventional contours.
More of reform.
Yeah. And I think people want it out of the box now. And this is the reason why Donald Trump got elected in America. And I've seen this building for a long time. So if I was back in frontline politics today, I would have a completely different attitude from the one I had in 1997 and in my 10 years, because we live in a different era. And this is the challenge today.
So tell us more about this attitude that you would have today, because back in your days, you designed a so-called third way for social democracy, where you were in a kind of ideological alliance with Gerhard Schröder and Bill Clinton back then. And of course, you also wanted to change things, maybe not disrupt, but fundamentally change things. How would you like to fundamentally change things today, or how it should?
Yes, I think
do that.
It's a good question. I mean, I think the kind of approach that we took, which was in a sense to try and get beyond the traditional distinctions of left and right, I think that's even more true today than it was back then. So in one sense, I think that approach is even more necessary. And we sometimes call that the center ground of politics, but it's an inadequate phrase, because the center suggests that you're just splitting the difference between the left and the right. Whereas I think today that approach is right, but it's got to be in pursuit of a much more radical agenda. And that's the challenge. That's the bad news, if you like, in politics today. People think the system's fundamentally broken. The good news is that you have today the instrument in your hands that can affect that radical change in a sensible manner, and that is the technology revolution. So a lot of what I talk about in the book and the work of my institute today is all around how you use technology to transform government and to reinvent and reimagine the state.
And are people right to think the system is broken?
Yeah.
It is broken?
Yeah, I think it is broken. I mean, look, it's not broken in the sense that you don't need a welfare system, or you don't need a healthcare system, or you don't need an education system. Of course you do. But it's broken in the sense that the state has become this vast behemoth. And, when you think of what it spends and its outcomes, it's not very good. And then maybe it's different in Germany, but, when I look at economic growth today in the UK, it requires some transformative measures in order to get that growth. And brilliantly, if you don't have growth, then you don't have the revenue, by the way, as a government to spend. Yeah. But in any event, I think the state, in the 19th century, the state was minimalist. Right? In the 20th century, it became quite maximalist. And I think in the 21st century, just like the Industrial Revolution created the modern state, this technology revolution has got to create a different type of state, much more strategic, much more empowering, much less controlling, recognizing that the state should be at the service of people, whereas I think people often regard the state today as trying to sit on their lives rather than help them.
Before we come to AI, which is an obviously interesting field, maybe ask you another question, because you started off with telling us that, there has to be a radical change. I guess when people think about radical changes these days, they hardly think about AI or technological changes. Well, they don't think of them first, let's say. They would rather think about bringing down immigration, kickstarting the economy. And I think when you took over as Prime Minister, this was a time of an economic boost in the UK. Now the economy has been flatlining. We have kind of the same problem in Germany. And people are very uneasy about the high levels of immigration. So how would you address these topics?
Yeah, so you've got two separate questions, although they, for the reasons you give, they're obviously linked. I mean, let's just deal with the immigration issue first, because that's a problem all over, again, all over the Western world. It's not different in Germany, the UK, America. Right. You have to distinguish between that section of opinion that is anti-immigrant, right, that dislikes immigration per se and doesn't want it, and the bit of public opinion that is not against immigration, provided it's controlled. And their anxiety is that at the moment the immigration is without control. And therefore, for example, in the UK, people's worry is whether you come here as an immigrant is determined not by policy, but by accident, or by the ability of people to migrate into your country. And by the way, a lot of people who come as economic migrants, maybe they claim asylum, but they're economic migrants. I don't regard those people as bad people. On the contrary, they're people searching for a better life. But the host country can't afford to have a situation where there aren't proper controls. So in my view, the thing about immigration is, if you don't have rules, you get prejudices. So how do you create the rules? And again, technology will provide you with a lot of answers for that. But we also do need to reform things like the asylum system and so on, because they were created for a different age. And you know, all of these things need updating. But immigration, if you're standing in a political contest today in the Western world and you don't have a strong, clear policy on immigration, you're going to lose. Now, the other part of this, which is growth, well, again, I don't see a route to improve productivity without the employment of artificial intelligence and technology. So whether it's the private sector or the public sector, this technology revolution is the big thing. And, you know, I have this conversation constantly with leaders when, you know, I'll talk to them about technology and I can see they're kind of thinking, yeah, well, no, it's a big thing. But, you know, is it good? Is it bad? And I say to them, it's good and bad. It's general purpose technology. Can you use it for bad things? Yes. Can you use it for good things? Yes. Don't debate whether it's a good or bad thing. It's a thing. In fact, probably today, it's the thing. In fact, I think it is. If I was back in government today, it would be the #1 thing I would be thinking about. How do I use technology, both for the private sector and the public sector? So that's the debate you need to have.
Do you think the UK is in a better place when it comes to the future of AI? Both in terms of the energy sector, you need loads of energy to power AI, but also in terms of regulation. I mean, there are critics in the European Union who say that the EU regulation is basically stifling the development of AI.
Yeah, well, they're right. I mean, the Draghi report. I mean, the Draghi report was a good piece of work. And the question for Europe is, can it deliver it? But if it doesn't, it's going to be in trouble. I mean, Europe's got to ask some fundamental questions. You know, look, I am pro-Europe and I'm just deeply against Brexit. So I speak from the point of view of someone who wants Europe to do well and wishes Europe well. But Europe's got to be really careful on this technology revolution. It cannot stifle innovation. If it does it, it will set back the European economy dramatically. And it will, by the way, undermine support for the European Union. You know, we've got to ask the question in Europe, where are big technology companies? I mean, it's
also like, in this regard, you are glad about Brexit, you know, for being out of this European realm of.
No, I'll never be glad about Brexit because there's a reason why it's a bad idea. But if there is any benefit from doing it, it is that if Europe moves in an adverse, in a too restrictive way on regulation, then of course Britain's got the advantage of being able to set a different framework. And to be fair to the new government here in the UK, it's taking AI very seriously, and it will set out I think a sensible regulatory framework for AI.
I would like to come back to what you said earlier, if I may. You said you're either have to be a disruptor or you're being disrupted. I found that very fascinating, and I keep wondering, it's easy for a populist leader to promise disruption. It might be harder for him to deliver on it, but that's a different question. But it's very much, it's a lot more difficult for a, say, centrist, conservative leader to promise and deliver on disruption, isn't it? Because all these leaders are bound to regulations and the rule of law and everything. So how do centrist leaders can promise and can deliver disruption in the sense that
through technology? It's as simple as that. Look, if you think about government today, if you take our healthcare system, we will have the ability today through preventive medical care to change our healthcare system radically. If you just take, for example, I was in Denmark the other day seeing the Novo Nordisk company. These GLP-1 weight loss drugs, they're revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, we should have a system in place that allows people who need them to get access to them.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to have drugs that will allow you, probably with 1 injection a year, to deal with high cholesterol. You're going to have the ability to do early diagnosis in a completely different way from before. Right. If you take our education system, you're going to get generative AI tutors, if you like, teachers that are going to better supplant existing teaching. We have through AI the ability to do lesson planning for teachers that radically cut the amount of time they spend doing lesson planning. There are a whole set of things. The whole of our welfare system can be transformed through the use of technology. So, and none of this is to say, because I want to emphasize this, that technology doesn't have a bad element to it. Look, some of the things that social media do is very destructive. And if we get to artificial general intelligence, which we almost certainly will do in the next few years, the potential downsides of that with bad actors is enormous. But the point is, we should at least embrace the opportunity. And that is the answer, because it's a very, you see, what people are saying is that barn that is the state, it needs to be completely deconstructed and reconstructed. Mm-hmm. If you're not going to do that, then the person who says, the populist who comes along and says, I'm going to burn the thing down, they're going to win.
Right, exactly. But how can technology help in the field of migration? Migration is about bodies moving through space. And it's about borders, and it's about security issues at the borders.
Yeah. It's also about, for example, I've advocated in the UK, we should have a digital ID for every citizen. At least it allows you to know who should be here and who shouldn't be here. I think you can do much, much better surveillance now and tracking movements of people. And of course, there are other things that we need to do. We need to, for example, in the Sahel group of countries at the moment, in Africa, in the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to have the next waves of migration coming if we don't help those countries. So I don't, it's not all about control for me. It's also about, I'm a passionate believer in helping the poorer nations of the world develop. I think it's in our interest too. So there's a range of things you need, and it's always going to be difficult. Immigration will continue to be difficult. Right. But countries that are anti-immigrant have got a problem. And you look at those people inventing the technology in America. How many of them are migrants?
Right, sure. But I guess the problem that we would like to address here might run a bit deeper, which is that the reason for the frustration that we are seeing, with the left-leaning establishment these days, in America, in Europe, even here in the UK, where Nigel Farage's Reform Party is surging in the polls, that has to do with a cultural alienation of working class people from the establishment, and we are seeing a backlash now. So
yeah, but it's not surprising.
Yeah,
I mean,
you can't address this with technology, can you?
No, you can't address that with technology. But that's just, I'm afraid the progressive part of politics has taken some just pretty foolish positions on some of these cultural issues over the last few years. I mean, you look at, there's no mystery to me why Donald Trump won in America. Why did he win? Well, because he won, first of all, because people do want the system fundamentally changed. And therefore, the small C conservative people looked like they were on the Democrat side. And secondly, the Democrats, took a range of positions on some of these cultural questions, transgender and so on, that are just, that alienate the broad mass of the public. Well, you know, if you're fighting an election, it's not a very sensible thing to do.
So are you saying that what preceded this shift to the right was a shift to the left?
Well, look, what has happened with a lot of progressive politics is that it's not quite sure what its economic mission is today. It's sure it's about social justice, but it's not quite sure how it achieves it. And my thesis is we should be the people who are the architects of this technology revolution and how you harness it and develop it. You can debate whether that's true or not, but it's at least a position, right? Whereas I think the progressive political side has really lacked an economic position other than give the state more power, which is not appealing, especially to a younger generation today. And so in default of that economic unifying message, there's been a tendency on parts of the left to put in place of that, you know, identity politics, which I think is a complete cul-de-sac for progressive politics, and a whole lot of sort of political positions, even around the climate issue, which seem very divorced from people's real needs. And, you know, if you do that, then you're going to pay a political price.
We're talking about your book on leadership. Is Donald Trump a leader in the sense of leadership you describe?
Well, there's no doubt he's a leader. You can agree or disagree with him, but you can't, I don't think you can contest the fact that he's got a strong position and will stand up for it.
Mm. You have always tried to govern from the center for the center. And I guess that's the major task for the political left and the political center these days, to reattach the majority of voters. What advice would you give Keir Starmer, the next German chancellor, whoever is in charge of Western?
Yeah, but I don't think it's difficult. You've got to be the disruptors, number one. And number two, on the cultural issues, you've got to take sensible positions. I still think you will win political power from the center if you're in the center, not as a kind of mushy middle, you know, which is sort of compromising between left and right positions, but from where you say, we will do a proper objective analysis of what's wrong, and we will go for policy solutions that work. And this is referencing our early discussion about the one word in German and French for politics and policy, where in my view, you've got to put policy first and politics second. Work out the right answer, and then you can craft your politics around it. But too often on the progressive side of politics, the ideology comes first. And when you do that, then you make a mistake.
It appears that the Democrats in America, did they even have a policy when they entered into the elections?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, they did, of course, have a lot of policy. You know, they could point you to a massive policy. But progressive politics has lacked a coherent view of what is happening in the world and how to respond to it. And if you don't have that, then you're always going to look weak, because you then, you know, I've been reading a biography of John Adams, one of the founding fathers of America. And he has this great phrase that he uses early in his political career, where he says, "I need ballast, otherwise I totter in the breeze." Right? And, you know, that's what we need on the progressive side of politics today. We need ballast. We need a governing vision, a clarity of direction. Otherwise, we're blowing this way and that. And then you get this social media, which is it's a very rough world out there. Yeah, right. And I think, again, what we have to understand is the public has a paradoxical view of social media. The public fuels it because it uses it. Social media comes from the public, but at the same time it looks for leaders that stand out against it. And too often, I think people from my side of politics, they do totter in the breeze. You know, wherever the pressure comes, they say, oh, got to respond to it.
It will be the fifth power, isn't it? Huh? It's a fifth power.
Well, it is. It's very powerful. And, you know, you guys in the conventional media, obviously it's a big challenge for you.
It is.
Now, I personally think it's a big opportunity for you if you keep to proper journalism, because I do think there is a yearning for that, which is the reason why, for example, I don't know what it was like in Germany, but here in the UK, you've got massive podcasts that are really quite popular. Yeah, because there's a whole section of the public out there that does distrust social media. It might read it, and as I say, it might even contribute to it, but it does distrust it.
From your perspective, what would be the wise policy toward regulating social media be? It was a European approach to not so heavily regulate social media. And now Donald Trump says it's over, and the companies follow him.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of things I'm very certain about, and I've been very clear with you.
You have.
Right. When I get to this one, I find it really difficult. I'm not sure. Because I think on the one hand, you want some discipline and some framework that excludes bad things. On the other hand, I think you've got to be really careful that, I mean, there are bad things like the abuse of children that no one's going to say is anything other than bad, but you've got to be careful when it comes to free speech, because there is a tendency in some quarters to regard people who disagree with you as bad people. Not necessarily bad people. They can be just people who disagree. So I think there was a tendency in social media to think that they had to kind of police people's views. That I think is difficult. But I think this will be an ongoing debate, and it's the one area where I'm a little less clear and certain.
Could we return to this very nice picture or image that you drew of the left being a ship without a proper ballast?
Yeah.
It sounds a bit as if the Tony Blair of today doesn't really have a ship that he would embark on. So where do you feel politically? Do you have a political home these days?
Yeah, I've got a political home. I'm still a member of the Labour Party and support the Labour Party and the Labour government. But, you know, I've always been on the sort of modernising side. And I think over this past period, the progressive side has looked like the guardians of the status quo in an age where people want the status quo changed. And if you do that, you end up as a conservative party, not called a conservative party, but really a conservative party, right? And that's a big problem.
And is that part of why the Democrats lost the election? Because they claim to be the defenders of democracy, and that just doesn't win you elections?
Yeah, it's also that in circumstances where people are saying the system's not delivering for me, if you're involved in a kind of somewhat arcane debate about whether the other guy's a Democrat or not, or is in favor of democracy or not, it just looks a bit remote to people. And some of the language used around, you know, Donald Trump was just extreme. And if you use extreme language about your opponents, then it tends to weaken your own credibility.
But isn't he extreme?
You know, the policies that he's putting forward are policies that, you know, okay, they're going to make big change, but that's the big change that people want. Now, would I be doing everything the same way in you know, same as in the UK? What some of the people on the right are saying, for example, we've got to grip this immigration problem. I mean, it's correct. So there's no, you're not going to win in politics unless you're cool-headed about an analysis of what your opponents are saying and why people might support them. And if you just sit there and say, well, they're awful people, it doesn't really persuade anyone, because they say, okay, but what about the issue that they're raising?
That's interesting, because I mean, the era of mass immigration to the UK started under your leadership. And back then there were good reasons for it. I mean, you embraced globalization, you needed people to come to the UK, you needed to create jobs. But with the benefit of hindsight, would you say that you underestimated both the amount of people who you drew to the UK and the cultural problems that may have come with it?
It's very important that we get the history of this right. Because when you go back and you actually look at what my government was doing, on asylum, where we had a huge spike in, you came in as there was an upward rise in asylum cases. By the time we left, they were a quarter of what they were when we came.
But we opened the UK for immigration from the EU.
Well, let's come to it. Right. Immigration as a whole was, by the way, half of what it is today. It is true, and people say, we got a lot more immigration from Europe. Okay. Now, it is true that we didn't impose the restrictions on, we could have had transitional arrangements for the people coming from East Europe when there was the accession of the Eastern European countries to the European Union. Now, it is also true that we underestimated the figures hugely. But we've got to put some other things in the other side of the ledger. Number one, people often think that the transitional arrangements were about freedom of movement. They weren't. They were about freedom to work. Right. Mm-hmm. People could still have come to the UK, just like Germany had the transitional arrangements. They still came to Germany. Right. Mm-hmm. And there's a case for saying it's better that they come and work legally within the system than illegally. Secondly, yes, we needed it for our economy, and our economy was very, very strong. You know, on the day I left office, we had $2 to the pound, and the economy was strong, right? But the third thing I will say to people is once I'd realized the numbers were far more than we had been told, and in certain areas, there were problems with influx, you know, for example, of Polish people, suddenly big communities happening, I would have been acting on it. I did more legislation on immigration than any other issue. So the idea that we had some open, you know, this has been a rewriting of history because of this issue to do with Europe. But I want to say one other thing about immigration because I think this is really important. I think there are two aspects to immigration, or the public's anxiety about immigration. One is on numbers, okay, because numbers are very, very large. People think, you know, can we really absorb these people? What difference it make to services and so on? That's understandable. The second is different, and it's very sensitive. It's where people believe that you have people migrating into your country, and their anxiety is that those people don't share the values of the host country. And that has been a particular problem with parts of the Muslim community. And my view is, again, you've got to be very honest about this and have an honest debate about it, because there is a problem. And you've got to deal with that problem in the right way, which is to say, look, there's a space for diversity, but there's a space for integration. And where that space for integration is properly defined, you've got to abide by it. And I think part of the problem is, you know, there is a reason why Nigel Farage in the Brexit referendum was pictured in front of a long line of Syrian refugees. Now, actually, as a result of Britain not being part of Schengen, we weren't obliged to take any Syrian refugees. But the reason he was in front of those, and not a group of Europeans, was because of that second question.
And looking back, would you say that this discussion was honest enough and openly enough about about problems resulting of a Muslim migration to Europe?
I think we have been hesitant for reasons that are understandable, because you don't want to stigmatize communities, and then of course people immediately accuse you of being Islamophobic and so on. But I think, again, it's a classic example. If people from my type of political position don't have an honest debate about it, then you'll find the issue exploited. No.
So Tony, maybe one last question. How hard is it to leave office?
Whatever anyone says, it's hard. Because, you know, you're I mean, I've been lucky.
What makes it hard?
Well, you've obviously got the power of the position. You've got a huge infrastructure around you. I mean, when I left office, I have 4 people coming with me. I had no money to pay them. We have 3 mobile phones in their office. And, you know, now I've been lucky because we managed to build an organization today. My institute's now is almost 1,000 people working for it in many different countries. And we rebuilt an infrastructure, and we can build it into something much bigger. But then that's the problem. I mean, you've got to, and no one who gets to the top position in politics is the type of person who, I mean, some people do actually, but I can't imagine, you know, retiring and then going off and playing golf for the rest of my life. I mean, it's just not, it's unlikely you would rise to that position if you had that type of mentality. So, yeah, no, it's tough, but you've got to, I have a chapter about it in the book.
Absolutely. And how hard is it to not intervene in the business of your successor?
Yeah, that can be challenging too. But I mean, I try to do it sparingly and supportably, but yeah, no, it's
right. There's one detail in your book we could hardly believe, namely that you did not possess a mobile phone during your tenure as Prime Minister.
Thank God. It was a great benefit. Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I used mobile. There's some, you know, someone from the office would give you a mobile, and if you were speaking to someone on the mobile phone. No, I didn't. And in fact, I got my first mobile phone the day I left office, day after I left office. And I actually then texted someone that I knew, but I hadn't realized that my name didn't automatically come out on the text. And I got a message back from the person saying, sorry, but who are you? I was sitting there thinking, it's only been 24 hours. But yeah, no, it's I actually think if I was back in office today, I think I still wouldn't have a mobile phone. I know leaders do, and I text a lot of leaders, but I think nowadays with well, put it like this, you shouldn't regard anything that's on them as secure, because it's not.
So do make use of technology, but put away your phone.
Well, yeah. And be careful with your own technology. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Very interesting conversation.
Brilliant.
Thanks.